Oh, so what does this all mean for the housing market and house prices in particular? Well, joining me earlier, two experts in property, John Symonds, who recently sold 80% of his Aussie home loans to the Commonwealth Bank, and economist and author Professor Steve Keynes. Gentlemen, welcome to the programme.
Hi.
John Symonds, start with you. Now, Steve Keynes late last year called you Mr. Bubble, I think. Do you see that there's still a surge left in the market?
I think that, we've got a very healthy housing market, but unfortunately it isn't evenly spread. I mean, if you take the Sydney housing market aside, you've got Queensland struggling, you've got South Australia struggling, where there's no real energy in housing prices. You then come to Sydney and we say, yes, Sydney's gone up something like 15-16% in the last 18 months. And that sounds like a huge increase. But if you have a look at the history, the 10 years before we started to see the rise, so go back 11.5 years ago, for 10 straight years, the average increase in housing in Sydney was the worst performing of any capital city, 2.2% per annum before inflation.
So, John, you still think there's a way to go, some way to go left in the property market?
I think there's a way to go, particularly in areas outside of Sydney. I mean, Melbourne's been quite buoyant as well, not quite to the Sydney levels, but Melbourne's had some years of housing appreciation when Sydney didn't. But I say it's heading into a more healthy state. We're starting to see Sydney sales slowing down. Last weekend's auction sales dropped below 80%. I think this is a good signal. We don't want to see prices going up by 3.5% every quarter, because that's not sustainable.
So, Steve Keynes, do you agree with this analysis, or are you still more of a Cassandra as of old?
Well, Cassandra about the fact that the house prices are far too high in this country, and it's not a tragedy that they're not going up fast now. They should be coming down, because they've got well and truly out of whack with affordability in this country. And we're putting all our eggs in the rising house price basket as well in terms of macroeconomic management. So I think it's a travesty to be doing this. But having said that, I think the travesty could go on for a couple more years, because we have additional factors that are pumping up the market now that we've never had before. The level of non-resident buying of new properties and the level of buying by self-managed superannuation firms of existing properties.
Now, there seem to be one or two property analysts around, Steve, who have had a little bit of a conversion in your direction, a bit more sceptical about prices, a bit more worried about them. Why do you think that is?
Well, Chris Joy's been the most vocal of those, and Chris used to argue that house prices move in line with disposable incomes, which is why John's point about Sydney prices rising at only 2% before inflation for some time meant a fall in house prices in Sydney relative to incomes. But Chris would say that all the time, they'll rise or fall in line with disposable incomes. Well, he's now had to modify a statistic that doesn't hold anymore. He said they've risen well and truly out of whack with disposable incomes. And because he thinks they should rise and fall in tune with disposable incomes, as I do as well, that's what they should do, he's now having to say, no, they're not doing that. They're doing it in line with a level of speculation driven by mortgage debt.
So, John Symonds, what do you think about this? We've got price growth acceleration, certainly in some markets, but disposable income is falling. Do you think that's a worrying sign for the market?
Well, it's always a worrying sign, and I've never not once said that house prices are too expensive in this country, and I've been saying that for 30 years. Every time we see a housing run, we hear bubble, because it's fair to say most countries around the world have had a housing bubble. And the analysts from abroad always say, well, why is Australia the only country that's not going to have a housing bubble, particularly when you look at affordability? But we've got totally different dynamics here. You look at the US, non-recourse. If the house value goes down, you hand the keys back to the lender. There's no personal recourse. So, it's crazy.
That's not the issue. I think that's the thing people focus on and say it's non-recourse loans there versus recourse loans here, which is why we didn't have a bubble. We did have a bubble. The difference was we could drop interest rates. In America, most housing mortgage loans are a fixed rate. So even though the central bank might drop rates like a brick as they did, it doesn't flow through to your mortgage payments. And if you can't meet them, if you lost your job, bang, you've got to sell the house and down go house prices. In Australia, as soon as we hit the crisis and the Reserve Bank finally woke up that there was one, because remember they put rates up for the first 6 months or so of the financial crisis. When they started dropping them, it fed straight through the mortgages. You didn't have to sell sell the place if you hadn't lost your job.
So Steve, what's happened to mortgage lending now?
Mortgage lending now in Australia is way higher than in America. I've got a chart that I put together to compare the level of mortgage debt.
Well, let's have a look at that chart now.
Yeah, and we normally get told that Australia, that America had this huge subprime bubble and Australia is quite responsible. If you look at this chart, you see back in 1980, mortgage debt in Australia was about 10% of GDP. America was virtually 40%. Now, during what we call the subprime bubble, look which one grew faster. It was mortgage debt in Australia that rose more rapidly, and now we have a mortgage debt level in Australia about 20% higher than the American situation.
So does this worry you, John Simon?
No, I look on housing as creating has been a great asset builder for Australia and Australians. It helps insulate government with social services in an ageing population, and it's forced people to save. And the great Aussie dream has always been, I want to own my own home.
It's becoming a nightmare at the cost now, John.
Yes, well, not at the moment, because we've got historic low interest rates, Steve. People can afford it today.
They look at the level of mortgage that they've got to commit themselves to, John, and they think, I'm not going to lock my life over that period of time in the future. The young are dropping out of the market completely. We're seeing the lowest level of first-home buyers ever, and that's because it's not the interest rate they're looking at. It's also saying, do I want to be taking on debt 10 times my income? They're saying no.
It's not only that, it's also the fact that, to get into new housing, you've got to go 30, 40 kilometres out of CBDs. You take Sydney, you've got to go 30 or 40 kilometres out. There's a social trend today.
Not helping all this is negative gearing for first-home buyers.
No, that's another incentive why people are investing in housing rather than equities.
But it's not helping your first-home buyers,
It's definitely not helping. I mean, you look at first-home buyer market, and I've been outspoken about this for years, because first-home buyers are being forced out of the market. Why? Affordability issues, because you've got a big surge of foreign investment. You've got great incentives for Australians to invest in housing. Negative gearing is one of them, and I think it's probably overly too generous and needs to be looked at by government.
So are you in fierce agreement, both of you, Steve?
On this one, John, and I'm totally in agreement. Yeah. The negative gearing has always been sold as something which actually improves the availability of rental properties in this country. That used to be true 25 years ago, when 60% of the money investors took out bought new properties. Now it's less than 5%. Investors actually buy less new properties than people buying houses to live in actually do. So it's a total furphy. We should get rid of it or quarantine it just for new properties and actually cause some properties to be built.
Another big inhibitor is the fact that we have never had an orderly supply of housing in this country. It's been negligent of federal government, state government, local government.
Well, I know this is something that the Commission of Audit brought up, that perhaps the Commonwealth Land Bank should be repositioned and basically made ready for sale.
Well, probably a great idea, and we've put in our paper to this new inquiry suggesting that we need an orderly supply of housing. Right now it's left to market forces, so when housing becomes popular, you've got all the developers rushing in, and it ends up being an oversupply. Then the market cools. The government ought to ensure that we got an orderly amount of housing to satisfy demand, but the other problem is not just the bureaucratic nightmare taking years to get approvals to erect new housing, it's the cost of new housing. The government, what I call taxes, when I was a kid, your taxes paid for services, for gas, water, electricity, roads. Today, on an average block in metro areas and regional Australia, it can cost between 100 and 150,000 per block, per apartment. And the developer passes that on to the first home buyer. First home buyer buys something for, say, 400,000, it really is worth 250,000, and they take on that debt, and this fuels into what Steve's saying. They're taking on what I say is unnecessary debt of at least 100,000 for 30 years.
And that's actually, John's got a very good point there too, because the government has actually got caught up in the whole bubble thing as well. When there's a house price bubble going on, government revenues rise and they look like they're good economic managers. That was really the story of both the Hawke-Keating government in the 80s and then particularly the Howard government in the 90s. And the state governments make revenue out of it as well. They've got an interest in this rising level of house prices. So,
Steve,
as the local governments.
What's the trigger for some sort of property collapse? Would it be when mortgage lending goes the other way?
Yeah, when mortgage lending, what really drives house prices up is the level of mortgage debt. And you want to have rising house prices, you've got to have accelerating mortgage debt. And that's exactly what we've got happening right now.
Do you think that's right, John?
That certainly contributes to it. But when you've got strong employment numbers, low unemployment numbers, and people have got great incentives to invest in housing. I mean, have a look. We've got something like 5.2 trillion in housing in Australia. That's something like 4 times the value of the ASX, 3 or 4 times the value of the whole ASX,
All right.
and 4 times what super. Housing is the biggest single asset that families get into to
only
create a
because
nest
the
egg.
prices are so high in this country. If we had even English level prices, you'd be talking about 3 trillion, not 5 trillion.
Well, of course, now one of the problems which has been highlighted again by the audit is for older people, and this idea of the family home, and that maybe in years to come that there will be an asset test on the family home for pensions. Steve, first, what do you think this is going to do to the market if it came in?
Oh, it could cool it if that actually hit it. But I think that the huge part of the problem here is we've been using housing, and particularly the prices of housing, not the supply but the price of housing, as economic management tools for the last 30 years. It began with Hawke in 1983 when Silverberg was his advisor, and we had the first dose of the first home owners scheme, which I'll call the first home vendors scheme. So we've been manipulating the market as a way of looking like we're running the economy well. And I would like governments to get out of asset markets. I don't mind them having a certain role in sponsoring new technology and stuff like that, but when they get into asset markets, they stuff it up. And we've got the most stuffed up asset market on the planet in this country, courtesy of government intervention.
John, what about a couple of the other ideas that the audit has? One is getting rid of the National Rental Affordability Scheme. Another one is dropping the pilot for the housing help for seniors. Now, these are all presumably assisting people to get into the market or stay in the market.
They're all band-aid jobs, you know, unless they address the major problem of shortage of housing, the expensive cost of housing. You're always going to have rental shortage. I mean, you know, if you don't have enough housing, there's not enough rental accommodation. You take Sydney.
Yes.
We're over 20,000 houses short a year, per annum, on the previous year. And what's government done about it? Very little.
And if they actually made negative gearing restricted just to new properties, that might actually address that problem.
Right. Finally, John, let me ask you about your recent sale of Aussie homes to CBA. As part of that sale, you got shares in the Commonwealth Bank. Now, the ACCC said, and I quote Rod Sims, "It would be naive to think the Commonwealth does not have influence." You say you're independent.
Well, Aussie as an organisation acts very independently because that's our business model. Our business model is, you know, a supermarket of home loans where we've got hundreds and hundreds of different loans from different lenders.
Aren't you going to be forced to take more?
Well,
Commonwealth
absolutely
products?
not. I mean, absolutely not. And let me tell you, we've got 1,000 mortgage brokers. I've never got up. None of our sales management's ever got up and said, you must sell this product or that product. They tell you to drop off because they feel that they are independent and they assess customers' needs and they shortlist which of the hundreds of products out there best suits their needs. And let me tell you, I quite laugh at this. Before CommBank first invested, their first 33%, which is about 6 years ago, they had a larger share of our mortgage distribution than they have today when they've taken shareholding in Aussie.
Briefly, one last one to Steve first. Your views on interest rates later this year?
Well, the Reserve Bank has tied itself up in knots because it wants to use interest rates to control the economy. Since the economy is not booming, they want to drop the rates. That causes the dollar to go down, which they'd also want to have happen, but it causes a house price bubble. They really can't do anything with it. They have got to bring in prudential controls on household lending, mortgage lending, before they can do anything effective with interest rates.
John, house price bubble, what's going to happen to rates?
I think interest rates will stay about where they are for the rest of this year, and I can't see government bringing in prudential controls. I know New Zealand did, but, you know...
They're brave over there, we're not.
Yeah.
All right. John Symonds, Steve Keynes, great to have you both on the show. Thank you very much.
Thank you.